everybody, to the Introduction to International Trade and Supply Chain Logistics. This is our first lesson, and we're going to review Chapter 1 today. And Chapter 1 is an optional chapter in the textbook, but really I hope that you get a chance to look it over because it's really important to understand where we've been, to understand where we're going to be going, and kind of really reanalyze where we are today. Because a lot of the things we do in the supply chain or in international trade in general is directly related to what we've done in the past. And all too often, we're going to find out that things that are done today in today's business was because that's the way the guy did it before me. That's not always the best way to do things. So I'm going to challenge you to look at history and let's try to learn from it. Now, in Chapter 1, we're going to lay out the foundation of international trade by looking at some of the remarkable growth since the middle 20th century, as well as look at some of the main players in world trade. This is an important foundation for this course so we understand the nature of international trade and why it's beneficial to countries throughout the world. Therefore, we're going to review some of the traditional drivers that drive us for international trade, such as cost, savings, looking at competition, what are competitors doing, market drivers, and technology. Technology has had a huge impact on where we're going today. Then we're going to quickly look at some of the theories that have evolved over time. It's a little beyond this course. I want to give you some background on it, and the textbook gives some great examples, which I challenge you to look at in more detail. And finally, we're going to look at the product lifestyle and the cluster theory. These theories in themselves will tell us why trade is successful in some locations and not others, and how trade developed in one country, such as technologies, will move to other countries following market demand and production. And then finally, we're going to look at what it takes to be successful in the international business environment. Now, international trade growth. Trade's been going on since time began. But as you can see from this slide, just from the 1950s, international has grown basically 2,900% just between 1948 and 2008 if we use today's dollars. From 518 billion per year in exports in 1948 to over 16.127 billion in 2008. Simply put, merchandise trade has tripled from 5,500 billion in 1998 to over 16 billion in 2008. And then look at services. Services alone have tripled from 1.3 billion in 1998 to over 3.7 billion in 2008. As you can see, trade is growing exponentially. But we also know in today's world, trade has also stopped. We're seeing the first reduction in trade in the last 50 years. The creation of international institutions help facilitate this international trade. We're going to look a little bit more at that. And also the reductions in costs, such as transportation and transit times, to make trade easier, make competition more realistic. And then basically there's been a greater acceptance of things foreign. And sometimes we'll see backlashes, such as right now, hey, things are made in China, or buy USA. But in general, we all have been buying products throughout the world, be it the shirts we wear, the foods we eat, the watches we have, to the cars we drive. International trade and acceptance of these different styles have been commonplace throughout the world, and I only see that going farther into the future. Now let's look at some recent international trade milestones. I don't want to get stuck on technical terms. I don't want to get stuck on special conferences or even dates. However, I think it's important for us to have this historical context, particularly in our recent past, to understand where today's international trade has come from. The first is probably the development of important treaties in some organizations, such as in 1944, the Bretton Woods Conference. This created the International Monetary Fund, more commonly known as the IMF, in December of 1945. Now, what's key is the IMF is somewhat of a controversial organization, but the IMF has basically set up our current international payment systems, provided stability with economies and governments throughout the world, and really stabilized the currency exchange rates that we use today. And also, we have the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, GATT, and that's been around from 1949 up until 1994, which in general resulted in the gradual reduction of average tariffs from over 40% in 1947 to about 4% in 2008. We've come a long way to bring down the obvious trade barrier, duties, and taxes. Later in this course, we'll talk about non trade barriers that also can be obstacles to international trade. In addition, in 1995, what we know as GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, became the WTO. It replaced GATT, and it's what we call enforces free trade, which is a concept that is growing year by year, decade by decade. Now, a really important treaty was the Treaty of Rome in 1957. In essence, most Americans and most people throughout the world are unaware of the Treaty of Rome and don't see its significance. However, in 1957, just after World War II, key European players signed this treaty, and it became the forerunner of what we see today as the European Union. And as we all know, the EU has been a counterbalance to North America and Asia and became an economic power in and of itself. Then there's other creation of other trade blocs, in particular in America, NAFTA, and we can see these throughout the world. And finally, there's the introduction of the euro in 2002. The euro is not only part of the EU and its general currency, although not all EU members use the euro, but it's become a strong currency that most countries are starting to adopt and again counterbalance America. Now, what makes this especially important is that the euro is not just a currency, but for these countries in Europe to give up their own currency, such as the French franc or the German Deutschmark, in and of itself, these currencies, this pride, this ability and belief in this EU has been a powerful and reason the euro is so successful. Only time will tell if the euro will continue to be as powerful and as strong in the years to come. Right now, US dollar used to be the strong currency. It's weaker, making our opportunities for international trade even better. US products are cheaper now on the international market. When we think of international trade and governing bodies, we obviously think of the WTO, or the World Trade Organization. It came into effect on January 1st, 1995, and in general, it replaced the current General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, otherwise known as GATT. Now, with any type of multilateral or multinational government, public, and even private organizations, when you have so many players involved, getting agreement on a precise and detailed plan is almost impossible. So, when you think of the WTO, always remember this is a negotiated treaty that took decades, starting back in the 40s in the Geneva round in 1948. Then in 1949, it went to ANSE, then to Torquay, then eventually back to Geneva in 1956. It had the Dillon rounds in 60-61, the Kennedy rounds from 64 to 67, then the Tokyo rounds from 1973 to 1979, and finally the Uruguay rounds, which brought us in 1986 to 1994, which then gave birth to the WTO. This is a long process. The WTO is in charge of basically enforcing free trade, but can it really enforce free trade? Isn't it hard to enforce free trade? And if you think it does enforce free trade, why? These are important questions because as entrepreneurs, small companies, even though we are trying to use the WTO to create a level playing field with countries of different sizes, with different economic and purchasing powers, it's very hard to get everyone to agree. And there are so many nuances that were negotiated throughout this treaty. Now, the WTO is doing a great job. However, is it going to be able to help you as an individual or a small company? And the answer is probably no. If there is a grievance with the WTO, you'll have to go through your country, and going through your country, it's going to have to file on your behalf. And by the time this whole process comes through, your company may be out of business, even if you are on the right side of this. So don't ever think that the WTO in and of itself will be able to solve all your problems. The WTO is, though, a great clearinghouse for information. It basically tells the world who is playing by our negotiated treaties, who's playing fair. That, in and of itself, does give it a lot of power. For example, if country A is making deals with country B, but it starts to renege on those deals by adding new duties or non tariff barriers, well, in essence, they're causing a lot of problems. And country B has a right to protest and say, "Hey, we have a negotiated treaty, and this country, country A, is not upholding that agreement." Well, the WTO will investigate, and that takes time, and will make a ruling. In essence, it would rule, probably in this example, in country B's favor. And everyone in the world would know that country A is a cheater or is not following the rules. It'll make their cost of doing business go up. It will make it more difficult for them to negotiate future treaties. So the WTO, as a clearinghouse of information, as a body recognized by all the major trading powers, is really, really important. But one thing a lot of people don't understand is not everybody is a member of the WTO. For example, at the end of 2010, one of the major goals was, how do we include Russia as a member of the WTO? They're not a signatory at this point. So be careful when you're talking about the WTO. Now, the WTO is a worldwide trade organization. There are also regional trade blocs or even bilateral agreements. In America, our most famous regional trade bloc is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Act. This gives us ability to work within Canada, Mexico, and the United States and have free trade amongst those countries. If you look on the slide, it's in the solid green. But you look at this map, which is probably dated about 10 years, there are tons of regional trade blocs. Now, this is really important from you from a supply chain perspective, is could be indicative of where you might put a sales office, where you might produce, where you might invest. So doing business in America, do you have to really build a plant in America? No. In this scenario, you could build it in Canada or Mexico. Vice versa, if you're doing business in Mexico, you could take advantage of some of the labor in the United States. These same types of trade blocs are all over the world, and these can have a strategic impact. We have the EU, for example, in Europe. We have the Central American Common Market that started in the 60s. We have what we call ASEAN in Southeast Asia, the Andean Community in South America, CARICOM, ECOWAS, the Gulf Cooperation Council, our NAFTA, the Economic and Monetary Community of Central Africa, the East African Community, etc., etc. This is changing all the time, but in a supply chain perspective, depending how you're going to attack a certain marketplace, you may want to see what regional trade opportunities are available, such as trade blocks. A big one might be in South America. You could be doing a lot of business as a traditional American company in Japan and Europe, and maybe even into Mexico and Canada. But maybe you haven't quite ventured into South America. Well, right now, through trade blocks, you might be able to do business in both Brazil and Argentina, which represent almost uh, two-thirds of the entire continent. So try to make sure we take advantage of these trade blocks, be aware of them, so you're not wasting money, investing poorly, because like any company, like any country, each of us only have so much funds to grow our business. An investment in North America means I can't invest in the Russian trade bloc. An investment in Brazil means I probably can't invest as much in China. So take advantage of these trade blocks so you can get the most bang for your buck. Now, who's the biggest? Who's the biggest exporter in the world? Who's the biggest importer in the world? Now, we all have our guesses, but it's important to know where these countries are exporting. Who are really the largest exporters? And who are really the largest importers? Not just the biggest, but who else is out there? What do you guys think? Okay, I'm sure you guys have given this a lot of thought. Did it surprise you? As of 2008, the largest exporting country in the world was actually Germany, then China, then the US. Yep, even the good old US of A was a large exporter back then. As you can see, as this list goes on, Japan, France, the Netherlands, Italy, the United Kingdom, even Belgium is a major player in the international exporting marketplace. And here are the remaining players: South Korea, Russia, and Hong Kong. In general, when we're looking at the largest exporting countries and the largest importing countries, we're really looking at the relative ranks, maybe of the US as an exporter, which is basically third after Germany and China, and also as an importer. Now, these countries are changing year by year. The numbers from 2006 are much different than 2008. What do you think they're going to be in 2010 and 2011? Now, the largest importers, they haven't changed. Yes, good old America. We're still the biggest consumers the world has ever seen. As part of our multicultural background, our acceptance of things that are different, and this is causing, though, a little bit of a trade imbalance, and we'll talk about that more in this class. This imbalance between the value of the exports, even though we're third, versus the imports for several countries, creating trade surpluses and deficits. The US, Germany, and China are also the biggest importing countries. But look at the top. The US is by far almost twice as much as Germany, and basically twice as much as Germany and China combined. So the US is a large consumer. The question we have to ask ourselves, will this continue? With a weaker US dollar, we'll talk about currency later in the course, will the United States become more of an exporting country, taking advantage of this weaker dollar and increasing our exports? But conversely, if we do have a weaker US dollar, we're not going to be able to afford exports. Exports from China, exports from Europe are going to be expensive relative to their locally manufactured competitors. This is a great opportunity for local manufacturers. Now here you see that the smaller countries, Spain, Hong Kong, South Korea, Mexico, they all represent a much smaller share of the overall market. And actually, the top 15 exporters appear to have almost 65% of the world imports. Now, that's going to be changing as these growth companies, such as the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, kind of take their rightful place as growing economies in the world market. And the rest of the world only represents 34%. So, this will be a changing place where we can see, hey, markets are saturated. Has China seen its day? Where will new markets be? Is Vietnam the up and coming market? Is Africa a place to invest? These are all opportunities that we can look into. But understanding where the people have been investing and importing is also important because, in general, international business, it's very hard to find a country who is not used to importing to all of a sudden change. And that has a lot to do with their ability to accept things that are foreign and or the government regulations, infrastructure, or other issues that can become an obstacle for international business. Now, the numbers I gave you for the three largest exporters and the three largest importers were based off empirical data from the year 2008. Now, we're in year 2010 going into 2011, so these numbers, these statistics are old. The question I ask you is, let's update those statistics. What are they? So I want each of you, one, determine who are the 2010 largest importers. Who are the largest exporters? I want you to list all of them out. I want you to cite your sources to back up this. It's not your personal feeling or something you might find on the internet. Back it up with a legitimate source. And then tell us where the biggest changes are. And if you're feeling a little aggressive, why don't you also tell me what you think the next changes will be? So you'll find in surprisingly quite a few areas, data from 2008 is a little antiquated. Things that are in 2010 and probably in 2011 are quite a bit different. I look forward to seeing your results. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'd love to hear it. Or we can start a discussion on this. Now, the question is, if we're going to do international business, what really forces or drives a company to get involved in international trade? For simplicity's sake, let's look at four major drivers: cost, competition, marker, market, and technology. All four of these drivers have huge impact on different companies, which gets them involved in international trade and actually helps them succeed. Let's look at cost first. Cost has many different variables, but in general, for export, some companies require large capital investments in plants and machinery. It becomes a strong incentive to spread the cost of these fixed costs over a large number of units, therefore causing them to want to export or take their product overseas, getting them into the international market. From an importing or an outsourcing perspective, some companies, in response to their consumers' demands, attempt to offer goods at as low a price as possible. There's a strong incentive to lower production costs, and several business processes are outsourced abroad. The whole process, the whole business portion is abroad, causing them to import it and bring it in. So these cost drivers have increased export opportunities and import opportunities. In addition, there's the competitive drivers. There's companies that follow their domestic competitors abroad to maintain their worldwide market share. Companies may retaliate against foreign competitors entering their home market by going to these competitors' home markets itself. The text and stories often talk about Linde Gas, based out here in the United States. It had a foreign competitor come into the U.S. market and started to expand, taking some of its domestic marketplace. Air Liquide, a French company, came into the U.S. market. Well, in response, not just to fend off the French competitor and to maintain its market share in America, they retaliated by going back to France and trying to grow their market in the French marketplace. Each company then had to keep their eye on the other. Companies also counter a competitor's new product by entering or offering a similar product often produced abroad. So it's kind of an importing strategy. They'll use a ancillary or complementary product produced in another company and through another country. Now, we also have market drivers. These market drivers are based on consumers' tastes and preferences, and they're becoming more uniform worldwide. A lot of it's due to television, movies, and especially the internet. Consumers have become increasingly knowledgeable about products, and they're willing to try foreign alternatives because they've seen them succeed. They can get reviews, and so therefore they're getting the best product at the best price based on their personal needs. And finally, let's look at technology drivers. Technology obviously has impacted its three predecessors. The World Wide Web, in and of itself, the internet, has changed international business. But the diffusion of information is universal. People in China, Brazil, Japan, Italy, and America, for the most part, have access to the same information. Competition for products worldwide, and the internet has allowed us to trade with one another. Simple companies growing out of a small company in China created Alibaba, pairing up buyers and sellers at a very low cost. Competition for talent and employees is worldwide. The world is flat, as Thomas Friedman writes. In essence, though, we can get resources throughout the world. We can be providing our services, our products from anywhere in the world. And we don't have to be in the same locations. So these four drivers have basically helped U.S. companies or increased or driven them into the international market. Now, for the scope of this class, we're not going to get into a lot of depth about international trade theories. The textbook gives a great introduction and detailed work, and I really encourage you to read it. However, I do want us to understand where today's current trade theories, which nobody is in agreement with, is today where things may go in the future, but we really have to understand where the basis of these trade theories come from. Initially, basically, most of the trade theory came from Adam Smith in his absolute advantage theory. Adam Smith's theory, called absolute advantage, was written in a text called The Wealth of Nations. He wrote back in 1776. When a nation can produce a certain type of goods more efficiently than other countries, it is best interest for that country to manufacture more of those goods than it needs and trade with countries that produce other goods more efficiently than the nation. The text on table 1.5 gives some really good examples that you can run through. Now, from that, you can see we have David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage. It's simply put, nations trade with one another when they can produce certain goods relatively more efficiently than one another. Most international trade today is explained by the theory of comparative advantage, and you can see that in the textbook on table 1.6. Then we move more into the Heckscher and Olin factor endowment theory, basically stating a country will enjoy a comparative advantage over other countries if it's naturally endowed with a greater abundance of one of the factors of economic production, such as land. The United States has tons of land, labor. We have skilled labor, but it's costly labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship seems odd, but it's a key fundamental to the U.S. economy. That's why we believe in our legal system, the protection of intellectual property, and gives us the creativity to become entrepreneurs, something that's culturally driven in our educational system. We also have the Raymond Verman International Product Life Cycle Theory. Now, product life cycles basically states over its life, a product will be manufactured first in the country in which it was developed, and then other countries, and eventually in developing countries. Now, simply put, is think of the TV. It was first developed in the United States and the United Kingdom. After a while, we started manufacturing the TV in other developed countries. But eventually, as a product competition came about, these demand was so great that basically this was moved into developing countries. Now the television, which was invented basically in the United States, really isn't produced here at all anymore. Is there really any U.S. companies that are TVs? Vizio, a recent example, is a new updated version of the U.S. television. However, do they really make it in the United States? So you can see how the product life cycle theory can be an impact on where things are made and where they are sold to. And finally, let's look at Michael Porter's cluster theory. A firm can develop a substantial competitive advantage in manufacturing certain goods when a large number of its competitors and suppliers are located in close proximity. The area attracts the most talented employees, and the extraordinary competition between the firms generate a greater need to innovate and become efficient. Such groupings are called a cluster. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. Now, besides going into more detail about economic theories such as Adam Smith, Ricardo, or Heckscher and Olin, let's look a little more detail at this international product life cycle and later the cluster theory. Now, in the international product life cycle, you can see how this is made in stages. Now, the question is, does it have to go through all these stages? Now, in stage one, the product is created in the developed country, such as the TV, and it's using a new technology and serving the local market. So any entrepreneur or company in the United States, their first objective is trying to serve the needs of their local market. A California company will probably focus on the West Coast first before it tries to do stuff in the South or the East Coast. Likewise, a company from Japan will focus on the Japanese market. But as this product succeeds and it reaches national borders and the proliferation of the internet, technology, communication, and information, people quickly are aware of this product where they're launching like movies in LA and Hong Kong at the same time. And products are being launched internationally, no longer just in one location. So, however, under the international product life cycle, in the second stage, as sales grow, the competitors start to make similar products. Competition's there. And there'll be competitors in other developed countries. They'll see your product at a trade show, they'll see your product on the internet, and they'll try to quote unquote copy it or make a similar type product. Basically, to respond to their local needs. But at the same time, we'll probably be manufacturing abroad ourselves as well as finding our own partners. But finally, manufacturing of that particular product has become routine. For lack of a better term, it's commoditized. And the costs need to be reduced because competition is fierce. And this production eventually moves overseas. And this has been going on for decades. It was in Japan, then Korea, then Taiwan, then Southeast Asia. Now it's in China. It's the first time it's really been a lot of manufacturing in just one country. But when you go to Chinese companies, they're already investigating moving their factories to Vietnam because they believe their cost of labor is too expensive. This is just a natural process that will continue. Eventually, China will be too expensive, and you will only be getting quote unquote higher quality products from China, and things will move to Vietnam, India, and probably eventually Africa. Now, let's look at Porter's cluster theory in just a little more depth, and I'll give you some examples. But it's an observation first made by Michael E. Porter that a firm can develop a substantial competitive advantage in manufacturing certain goods when a large number of its competitors and suppliers are located in close proximity of each other. Because this area then basically attracts talent. If I want to get a job, I'm a skilled laborer, I'll go to the market that can provide me the most opportunities. This extraordinary competition between firms generates a greater need to innovate, become more efficient, provide better services, and try to maintain and keep the best employees. This grouping then becomes a cluster. Now, the cluster theory, let's look at a couple examples. Here I've just put a few down. Silicon Valley, we all know about this, information technology. Now let's look at Silicon Valley. Why can't people provide a competitor to Silicon Valley? Well, they've been doing it for such a long time. It's brought more and more technology companies. These technology companies have sub companies who supply them. Other cottage industries go around that to provide services, to provide infrastructure, to provide other technologies, components, tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 suppliers just to support that. And that is a big attraction to the top employees, the top skilled labor, not only in the West Coast, the entire United States, and really the world. You would think that even in the United States, the Ivy League schools of the East Coast, Harvard, MIT, Yale being basically spitting distance from each other. They can't really compete with Silicon Valley. The best of the world all come to these locations. And then new companies are spawned off because the competition is so fierce. You can also see this in Italy with ceramic tiles, France with porcelain, the best watches out of Switzerland, socks and hosiery out of China, and then even recreational vehicles out of Indiana. And I know you guys can think of dozens and dozens of other examples. Now, to bring this all together, let's look at the international business environment. What are some of the things we should consider? What are the key elements? Well, obviously, one of them is culture. There's so many different cultural differences that's really hard for a lot of us, particularly Americans, to understand. Think of some of the issues even from demographics. Countries that we know quite well, China, Japan, In Korea, those countries basically are 90 to 95% one ethnic group. So they're used to having more of a group think mentality. Obviously, there's some differences and nuances. At the same time, you look at countries like the United States and Brazil, they're very multicultural environments. Multicultural environments have a tendency to bring more conflict because there's a lot more differences. That conflict is natural for us. We don't even see it as conflict. We see it as challenging each other, improving each other. It is natural. It is part of our culture. Therefore, sometimes communicating with Japan and Korea and China, in my example, may be difficult because the way we approach something, the way we communicate with them, we are talking from two different levels. We may say the correct words, but that's really influenced heavily by our cultural biases, by our experiences, our backgrounds. Likewise, the way they take our message, it will be biased by their experiences, their backgrounds. So understand there'll be cultural differences just in communication. Understand those demographics. Also, the economics. Where is this country on the economic development? Is it a developing country? Well, a developing country isn't really thinking right away about green technologies. They're thinking about feeding their people. They're thinking about educating their people. Likewise, what are the regulations and laws? Are they going to have strict green policies, strict regulatory policies, or are they more lax? Do they have strict labor laws to protect the labor force? Brazil, it's a developing country, but it has a very regulated, very expensive place to do business. Labor is expensive there. Do they have the infrastructure? And the infrastructure could be so many things. It could be communications. It could be roads, highways, airports, utilities. It could be even the legal system. All this has an impact on the business environment. We also have communications. Can you imagine now if you didn't have your cellular phone and couldn't get service for days? Or how about if you couldn't get Wi Fi or your computer broke down? Much of the international environment is different from the domestic environment. You really have to have people that can encapsulate that. If they don't, you're going to have some challenges in the international business field. So, as you already know, in international business, there are so many variables to be involved. Just look at this diagram. You have marketing, cultures, finance. What currency are we using? What are the payment terms? Economics, travel. How do I get there? How do I communicate with them? Language study, foreign contacts. All of these intertwine to create the business environment. I got to tell you, after my 20 years experience in business, a lot of this is a little scary and intimidating, but I got to tell you, it's the most fun I've ever had in my life. To be successful in international business or logistics, it's not only important to have an understanding of the supply chain, of logistics, or of your particular business environment, it's also fundamental to understand the international environment, how these things interconnect with each other. And this can be achieved by learning a foreign language, taking classes in international economics, international finance, intercultural communication, international marketing, or just traveling a lot, meeting new people, meeting foreign nationals, and making an effort to understand what is happening in these foreign countries. It's like everything I've experienced in life. A lot of my assumptions are broken down once I have interaction with it. You find out that people really aren't that different. Cultures are different, but there are more nuances. And it's always exciting to learn something new. I hope you take that mindset into this course with you. And also remember, when we make these business decisions, when we look at the quote unquote supply chain, I challenge you to also remember it's very easy to be a Monday morning quarterback saying, oh, we should have done this, or they should have done that. Remember, these decisions are made on the spot with all these variables that are very dynamic. Also remember, you don't have unlimited funds. If you invest in one country, you can't necessarily invest in another. So all of these will have an impact on your choices within the supply chain. I hope you enjoyed chapter 1 and look forward to talking to you guys more as we move more into the supply chain in detail.